Next, we'll have Emily Hazelwood, an undergraduate art history major, and her paper today is Faith in a New Campus. Emily.
Thank you. Hello. I'm going to get right into it. Deinstitutionalization, the act of replacing long-term care mental health facilities with less isolated mental health services, became a national movement around the 1950s. The South Carolina State Hospital was itself taking a turn down a new path at this time. The hospital began to change the ways in which patients lived and were treated. Though buildings were being added to the site at this time, there was a shift away from the buildings and practices of the hospital's past. The South Carolina State Hospital continued to grow with the addition of more community-friendly structures. Buildings such as a library, an auditorium, and the one I have focused on, a chapel. For those who may not be familiar with it, the Chapel of Hope, featured here, is a large colonial revival-style building with an impressive facade featuring a large Doric portico. With the addition of a chapel on a new campus, the South Carolina State Hospital was physically and figuratively shifting with the changes in mental health. Thanks to the extensive collection of the hospital's secretary, Inez Fripp, right here, there is a wealth of information about the chapel available at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Among the files of information left by Fripp on the hospital were several scrapbooks containing photographs, newspaper clippings, and other material concerning the site. It is within these books where one can uncover the story of the chapel and those who worked there. Religion is ever present when looking at the history of this site. Before the chapel was built, there is evidence that religious gatherings were held in various buildings around the campus. Religious services were provided since the first patient was admitted to the Mills Building in 1828. Services were held within the Babcock Building, as well as within other buildings on the site. Religious counseling or therapy is cited as a service the chaplains would offer to new patients and patients that required more regular visits. I will further discuss the role of chaplains in a moment. With religion as an ever-present aid to the care and treatment of patients, it is no surprise that the need for a religious gathering center would arise. Following World War II, percentages of Americans going to church grew. Not only was the country coming back together after the experience of a war, much of the country saw a new wealth arise. Many churches were built on the affluence that arose during this time. The 135th Annual Report from 1958 discusses the Church Building Fund. This fund strived for $60,000 to build a structure solely for religious purposes. The asylum was moving along with the national trend. Protestantism was growing to be the most practiced faith in rural southern areas. In addition to this renewed need for practiced religion, the number of patients living at the hospital had greatly increased. It was no longer practical to have patients gather within the wards and other buildings on the site. This structure would enable patients to attend religious services, much like the community outside the campus would. Prior to this, patients would have to attend Sunday services in auditoriums of alternate buildings. This building would also provide a place for a chaplaincy department. Prior to this, chaplains did not have a concentrated working location on the campus, which would also require them to maintain a position within a local church in addition to working at the hospital. One may find it odd that the campus was calling for funds for a new building at a time when the nation was moving away from the asylum campus. The buildings in which the hospital was seeking to build were far different from the buildings of the past. The canteen, library, auditorium, chapel, Dick's Drive houses, and Williams buildings were of different styles. These buildings are situated on streets next to Babcock and Mills rather than behind them. These buildings together, in a sense, would create a new campus, one that included community involvement rather than asylum isolation. While much of the campus is situated behind the Babcock building and its infamous dome, These buildings are large enough to be seen from the street. An onlooker may even confuse the chapel, the library, and the Williams buildings as being part of a different organization. These buildings were not meant to be hidden from the public's view. Once a fund for the chapel was established, a bid was held in 1963 to determine which architecture firm would build the building. A second bid was necessary because the original responses exceeded the limit of the fund. The initial fund for the chapel greatly underestimated the actual cost for this project. Donations were collected through contributions from patients, businesses, approval from legislature, and contributions from churches around the state. These are the funds that built the chapel. The architecture firm Lafay Fair Lafay & Associates secured the bid. In 1963, a meeting of the Religious Council voted to name the building the chapel. It would later come to be known as the Chapel of Hope. A groundbreaking ceremony was held December 8 of that same year. Construction began the following day. A year later, the cornerstone was laid. The next year, the steeple was raised. Not long after, the church opened its doors for a dedication service. The Palmetto Variety, a newsletter printed by and issued within the hospital, stated the chapel as being filled with patients for the dedication service. Thanks to a box located within the archives, there is an entire file dedicated to the architect's correspondence with the hospital. The architects were often in contact with the hospital, for example, making recommendations for insuring the building and for fireproofing it. The hospital was just as involved with the architects, requesting changes to the aesthetics of the building, such as removing and replacing light fixtures. A letter from 1964 states that old brick would be used for all face brick on the chapel. The Palmetto Variety states this old brick as being brick from a lowered wall of separation that once surrounded the campus grounds. The removal of an outer wall not only provided the material to build the chapel, it also opened up the campus to the view of the surrounding community. No longer hidden behind a wall, the community was able to see what was happening on campus. Not only was the campus more open to the community life was more available to patients. The choir provided a Sunday service ritual for patients and gave them more ways to be involved in activities on the campus. The chapel put on an annual Christmas pageant featuring patients as actors. There were voice and handbell choirs for patients to be a part of, and this also opened up opportunities for the outside public to become involved with the hospital. The Columbia community could be involved with the chapel by volunteering. The need for volunteers and donations was especially strong around the holidays. The chapel hosted a fund called Operation Santa Claus, in which they strived to guarantee each patient on the campus a Christmas gift. The bell within the steeple of the chapel is another item reused from the campus. This bell was initially situated at the hospital entrance gate. By repurposing materials from the hospital's past, the hospital was making a conscious effort to positively change its image and its use. As mentioned before, with the addition of the chapel came the addition of a chaplaincy department. This building would be known as the Kempson Center, and this is what it looks like today. The building was named for J. Obert Kempson, chaplain from 1933 to 1938, and chief chaplain from 1940 to 1965. Kempson is known for developing the first program of clinical pastoral education in the Southeast in 1946 at this hospital. The 3 full-time chaplains who worked at the Kempson Center maintained the duties of interviewing new patients and providing religious counseling to those patients deemed in need of their service. The chaplains paid midweek visits to the wards to provide religious counseling and guidance to those patients who were too ill to visit the chapel for Sunday services. It was not only the chaplains who performed these services for the entire campus. By May of 1964, the Kempson Center was able to hold 10 theological students. These students would assist the chaplains in their duties during 12-week summer programs. One may ask, why was it important for a chapel to be on this site, besides giving patients a place to gather for religious purposes? Churches have long served the function as bringing a community together or holding one together. At a time when the eyes of the nation were upon mental health treatment, when pressure was coming from all sides to provide adequate care to patients, it is not surprising, in fact, it is arguably logical, that the hospital would seek to place a chapel on the campus. Perhaps it was to serve not only the patients, but to serve the campus as a whole. Not only to show the outside community that good things were happening on this site, but also to hold this community together. As Reverend J. Ober Kimpson told the Herald Journal in 1980 about the lowering of the wall separated the hospital from the community. The wall coming down said, "We have nothing to hide. It's like opening up the hospital and saying, 'Here we are.'"